The early morning sun cast long shadows across Harold Thompson's weathered front porch as he eased himself into his favorite rocking chair. At 93 years old, his movements were slower now, but his eyes remained sharp and alert, scanning his beloved garden with the same attention to detail he had developed during his years as a World War II reconnaissance officer. Harold lived alone in his corner house on Maple Street, a modest two-story home in Springfield, Missouri, that he and his late wife Martha had purchased 50 years ago. The house stood out in the neighborhood, not because of its size or style, but because of the stunning rose garden that wrapped around it like a colorful blanket. Every morning, without fail, Harold would wake up at exactly 6:30 a.m. Old military habits died hard. Today started like any other day. He put on his warm blue cardigan, the one Martha had given him for their last Christmas together 3 years ago, and made his way downstairs. His joints protested with each step, but Harold never complained. "These old bones have seen worse," he would often tell his concerned neighbors with a gentle smile. In the kitchen, he followed his usual routine. One slice of whole wheat toast, a soft-boiled egg, cooked for exactly 4 minutes, and a cup of black coffee. Harold ate at the small kitchen table, Martha's empty chair across from him serving as a quiet reminder of his solitude. The morning newspaper lay unopened beside his plate. He would save that for later, after his garden work. By 7:15 a.m., Harold was in his garden, wearing his wide-brimmed hat and carrying his trusted gardening tools in an old military canvas bag. The roses were his pride and joy, something he had started cultivating after retiring from his job as a high school history teacher 28 years ago. He had 37 different varieties, each with its own story and meaning. The yellow roses near the mailbox were Martha's favorites. The red ones by the front steps came from a cutting his granddaughter Emily had given him. The white roses along the fence were planted in memory of his war buddies who never made it home. Harold knew each bush by heart, tending to them with the gentleness of a father caring for his children. As he carefully pruned a climbing rose that had grown too wild, Mrs. Chen from next door walked by with her small dog, Pepper. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," she called out, waving. Harold straightened up slowly, offering a warm smile. Mrs. Chen was one of the few neighbors who still took the time to stop and chat. "Beautiful morning, isn't it, Mrs. Chen?" Harold replied, wiping his brow with a handkerchief. "Would you like some fresh roses for your table?" He often shared his flowers with neighbors, believing that beauty was meant to be shared. While they talked, Harold noticed a moving truck pulling up to the old warehouse across the street. The building had been empty for nearly 2 years, its windows boarded up and walls covered in graffiti. He watched with mild curiosity as several men in leather jackets gathered around the truck. "I heard someone bought the warehouse," Mrs. Chen said quietly, clutching Pepper's leash a little tighter. "Some kind of club, they say." Harold nodded thoughtfully, returning to his roses. Change was part of life. He knew that well enough, but something about those leather-clad figures made him uneasy. As the morning wore on, more motorcycles began arriving at the warehouse. Their engines shattered the peaceful quiet of Maple Street, causing Harold's hands to shake slightly as he worked. The rumbling reminded him of distant artillery fire, a sound he had hoped to forget decades ago. Inside his house, on the mantelpiece, sat Harold's military photographs and medals, including a Purple Heart he rarely talked about. Next to them stood a more recent photo of him and Martha on their 60th wedding anniversary, both smiling despite her illness. Looking at these memories through his living room window, Harold couldn't help but wonder if the peace he had found in his garden was about to change forever. Little did he know, this ordinary spring morning marked the beginning of an extraordinary chapter in his long life, one that would challenge everything he thought he knew about friendship, courage, and the power of understanding. The Thunder Raiders Motorcycle Club wasted no time making their presence known on Maple Street. Within a week of moving into the old warehouse, they had transformed the building's dull exterior with their bold black and silver logo, a skull wrapped in chains with lightning bolts shooting through its eyes. The once quiet neighborhood now echoed with the constant roar of motorcycle engines and loud music. Harold watched from behind his living room curtains as club members came and went at all hours. He counted at least 20 different motorcycles, their chrome parts gleaming in the sun. The bikers themselves were a rough-looking bunch, most of them sporting tattoos, leather vests, and long beards. Their loud laughter and crude language carried across the street, making Harold wince every time he worked in his garden. Mrs. Chen stopped walking past the warehouse altogether, choosing a longer route to walk her dog Pepper. Other neighbors began doing the same, crossing to the opposite side of the street when they had to pass by. The Thunder Raiders seemed to enjoy the fear they created, often revving their engines louder when they noticed people hurrying past. One particularly hot afternoon, Harold was carefully watering his roses when three younger club members pulled up on their motorcycles. They parked right in front of his house, their engines drowning out the peaceful sound of his sprinkler. The youngest one, who couldn't have been more than 25, caught Harold's eye and made an exaggerated saluting gesture. "Hey, Gramps," the young biker called out, nudging his friends. "Standing at attention there with your little water gun." His companions laughed, one of them making mock marching movements. Harold's hands tightened around the garden hose, but he said nothing. He had faced real enemies in his time. These young troublemakers were just showing off. Still, their mockery stung more than he wanted to admit. The harassment continued over the next few weeks. Sometimes they would drive by late at night, engines roaring deliberately loud near Harold's bedroom window. Other times, they would gather on the sidewalk near his property, leaving behind cigarette butts and empty beer cans. Harold found himself sleeping less and less, the unexpected noise bringing back memories of nights spent in fear during the war. His granddaughter Emily noticed the change in him during her weekly Sunday visits. "Grandpa, you look tired," she said one afternoon, helping him deadhead some roses. "Maybe you should consider moving to that nice retirement community near my house." Harold shook his head firmly. "This is my home, Emily. Your grandmother and I built our life here. I'm not leaving because of some noisy youngsters." But the situation was wearing him down. He started taking his meals inside instead of on the porch, and his daily gardening sessions grew shorter. The peace he had found in tending his roses was being stolen from him, bit by bit. The local police weren't much help. When Harold finally called them after finding empty bottles thrown into his garden, they just shrugged and said there wasn't much they could do unless they caught someone in the act. The Thunder Raiders seemed to know exactly how far they could push without crossing any legal lines. One morning, Harold noticed Mike Steele Davidson, the club's leader, watching him from across the street. Steele was different from the others, older, more serious, with a military bearing that Harold recognized immediately. Their eyes met briefly, and for a moment, Harold thought he saw something like respect in the other man's gaze. But then Steele turned away, barking orders at some club members, and the moment passed. The breaking point came on a quiet Sunday morning. Harold had just finished his breakfast and was looking forward to working in his garden before the day got too hot. As he stepped onto his porch, he froze. His heart seemed to stop beating for a moment as he surveyed the damage before him. Motorcycle tracks cut through his carefully tended flower beds. The yellow roses, Martha's favorites, were crushed and broken, their petals scattered across the lawn like fallen soldiers. Empty beer cans and cigarette butts littered the ground, and someone had spray-painted a crude gesture on his garden wall. For the first time since Martha died, Harold felt truly alone. He sank onto his porch steps, his aged hands trembling as he picked up a broken yellow rose. Around him, the morning was quiet, but he knew it wouldn't last. The Thunder Raiders had declared war, and he had no idea how to fight back. Harold spent the entire morning trying to salvage what remained of his beloved garden. His old hands shook as he gathered broken stems and crushed flowers, placing them carefully in a cardboard box. Each damaged rose felt like losing a dear friend. The tire tracks cut deep into the soil, destroying not just the flowers but years of careful cultivation. Mrs. Chen came over as soon as she saw him working, bringing him a thermos of hot tea and her garden gloves. "Mr. Thompson, this is terrible," she said, kneeling beside him despite her arthritic knees. "We should call the police again." Harold shook his head slowly, watching as another neighbor, Mr. Rodriguez, walked past quickly, averting his eyes from the destruction. Just 6 months ago, that same neighbor would have stopped to chat about gardening tips. Now, everyone was too afraid to get involved. "The police won't do anything," Harold replied, his voice heavy with resignation. "They'll say there's no proof it was the Thunder Raiders." He picked up a crushed yellow rose, remembering how Martha would always put one in a small vase on their bedroom windowsill. The memory brought tears to his eyes, which he quickly wiped away with his sleeve. Throughout the day, other neighbors passed by. Some offered sympathetic glances, others muttered angry words about the bikers, but none stayed to help. The sound of motorcycles from across the street seemed louder than ever, almost like they were celebrating their victory over the old veteran. By late afternoon, Harold's back was aching fiercely from bending over his ruined flower beds. The box beside him was full of broken roses, and the spray-painted obscenity still marked his garden wall like an ugly scar. He stood slowly, using his garden spade for support, when he heard the familiar rumble of motorcycles approaching. 3 bikes pulled up at the warehouse across the street. Harold recognized the young troublemakers from before. They looked at his destroyed garden and laughed, making exaggerated saluting gestures. One of them revved his engine repeatedly, the noise echoing off the houses like mocking laughter. "Hey, Grandpa," one called out. "Looks like your flower parade got rained on." The others joined in with crude jokes about his garden, their voices carrying clearly across the street. Harold felt something snap inside him. The grief over his destroyed garden suddenly turned to anger, not the hot, quick anger of youth, but the cold, determined anger of a man who had seen real war. He straightened his back, despite the pain, and stood at his full height. For a moment, he was transported back to 1944, standing with his unit in France. They had faced real enemies then, not bullies on motorcycles. Harold had earned his Purple Heart protecting his fellow soldiers, and here he was, now being tormented by young men who had no idea what real courage meant. Just then, Emily pulled up in her car for her regular Sunday visit. She took one look at the destroyed garden and her grandfather's face and immediately pulled out her phone. "That's it, Grandpa," she said firmly. "I'm calling the retirement home right now. You can't stay here anymore. It's not safe." Harold watched as more bikers gathered at the warehouse. Some were working on their motorcycles, others were drinking beer and playing loud music. Through the open warehouse door, he caught a glimpse of their club meeting room, with flags and banners hanging on the walls. Something about those banners caught his eye, particularly one that looked like a military flag. As he studied the warehouse more carefully, Harold noticed other details he had missed before. The way some members carried themselves, the military-style organization of their parking area, the ranks they seemed to follow. His trained eye began to see patterns that reminded him of his own military days. That's when Harold made his decision. He turned to Emily, who was still arguing with someone on the phone about immediate placement options. "Put the phone away," he said quietly but firmly. "I'm not going anywhere." Emily stared at him in surprise. "But Grandpa, look what they did. You can't stay here alone with these thugs across the street." Harold picked up the last broken rose from the ground, studying it thoughtfully. "I'm not going to run away," he said, his voice growing stronger. "I didn't run in 1944, and I'm not running now. But I am going to try something different." He looked across at the warehouse, his mind already forming a plan that would surprise everyone, including the Thunder Raiders themselves. What Harold had just realized would change everything, but first, he needed to confirm his suspicions about the club's leader, Mike "Steele" Davidson. He had seen something in Steele's eyes that morning, something that told him there might be more to these bikers than met the eye. After sending a worried Emily home with promises that he would be careful, Harold spent the rest of Sunday afternoon watching the Thunder Raiders from his living room window. He noticed how the members saluted Steele whenever he walked past, not mockingly like they did to him, but with genuine respect. It reminded him of military protocol, though much more casual. The next morning, Harold woke up earlier than usual. Instead of starting with his normal garden routine, he sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and opened his laptop, a birthday gift from Emily that he rarely used. His fingers moved slowly over the keyboard as he typed "Mike "Steele" Davidson Thunder Raiders" into the search engine. The results surprised him. There was a local newspaper article from 5 years ago about a veterans' charity ride organized by the Thunder Raiders. The photograph showed Steele, looking younger but just as stern, standing next to a group of Vietnam War veterans. The article mentioned that Steele had served 2 tours in Vietnam with the Marine Corps. Harold's hands trembled slightly as he read further. According to the article, Steele had earned a Silver Star for bravery under fire while saving 3 of his fellow Marines. The Thunder Raiders, it seemed, had started as a support group for veterans before evolving into a larger motorcycle club. As he closed the laptop, Harold heard the familiar rumble of motorcycles. He walked to his front window and watched as club members began arriving for what seemed to be their morning gathering. Steele was standing in the warehouse doorway, checking something on a clipboard. Even from across the street, Harold could see the military bearing in his stance. Making his way to his destroyed garden, Harold began clearing more debris. He worked slowly but purposefully, knowing that he was being watched. Sure enough, within an hour, he noticed Steele walking across the street toward him. The other bikers fell silent, watching their leader approach the old veteran. "Need any help with that?" Steele's voice was gruff, but not unkind. Up close, Harold could see the Marine Corps tattoo on his forearm, partially covered by his leather jacket. Harold straightened up slowly, looking Steele directly in the eyes. "Semper Fi," he asked quietly, using the Marine Corps motto. Steele's expression changed slightly, surprise, then recognition. "You serve?" he asked, his tone different now. "Army, World War II, Pacific Theater," Harold replied, then gestured to his ruined garden. "This reminds me of some gardens I saw in Manila after the shelling. Never thought I'd see something similar in my own yard." Steele's face darkened as he looked at the destruction. "Some of our younger members can be troublesome," he said carefully. "They don't understand certain things." Harold nodded, then reached into his pocket and pulled out an old, worn photograph. It showed a much younger version of himself standing in a military hospital garden in the Philippines. "After I got hit in '44, gardening helped me heal," he explained. "The nurses there taught me how to grow things again when I could barely hold a trowel. Been doing it ever since." Steele took the photograph carefully, studying it with the respect of someone who understood its significance. Behind him, several other club members had drawn closer, curious about their leader's conversation with the old man they'd been tormenting. "Your younger guys," Harold continued, handing Steele another photo, this one showing his Purple Heart medal next to Martha's picture. "They like to salute me as a joke. But you and I both know what real salutes cost, don't we?" Steele handed the photos back, his expression thoughtful. Harold could see the wheels turning in the younger veteran's mind as he looked around at the destroyed garden, then back at his clubhouse where some of the younger members were watching. "The garden," Steele said finally, "it helps with the memories." Harold nodded. "Some nights are still hard, even after all these years." Martha understood that. "She's gone now, but these roses—" He gestured to the damaged flowers. "They gave me a reason to get up every morning." Steele was quiet for a long moment, looking at the tire tracks that cut through Harold's flower beds. Harold could see the internal struggle on the younger veteran's face, the conflict between his role as the club's leader and his understanding of what the garden truly meant to a fellow veteran. That's when Harold realized he had found something more valuable than just information about Steele's past. He had found a connection, a bridge between two different generations of soldiers who both understood the true cost of war and the difficult path to healing. The next morning, Harold put on his best suit, the dark blue one he usually saved for special occasions. He carefully pinned his Purple Heart medal to his lapel and combed his silver hair neatly. In his jacket pocket, he placed several old photographs and a folded piece of paper containing notes he had written the night before. At exactly 7:00 p.m., when he knew the Thunder Raiders held their weekly meeting, Harold walked steadily across the street. Several bikers lounging outside the warehouse straightened up as they saw him approach, surprised by his formal appearance and the glinting medal on his chest. "Evening, gentlemen," Harold said calmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had once commanded troops in battle. "I'm here to speak with the whole club." The younger members exchanged uncertain glances. One of them, the same guy who often mocked Harold's gardening, started to make a joke but fell silent when he noticed Steele watching from the doorway. Steele studied Harold for a moment, then nodded slightly. "Come on in, sir," Steele said, using the respectful address naturally. The other bikers parted like water, creating a path for Harold to enter their clubhouse. Inside, the warehouse had been transformed. The main room was filled with rows of chairs, facing a small stage area decorated with flags, including, as Harold had noticed before, military banners from various branches of service. About 40 club members were gathered, their usual loud chatter dying down as Harold walked in. Steele led Harold to the front of the room. "Brothers," Steele announced, his voice commanding immediate attention, "we have a guest speaker tonight." He turned to Harold, gesturing for him to take the floor. Harold stood straight despite his aging joints, surveying the room with the same steady gaze he had once used to assess battlefields. The silence was complete now, even the usually restless younger members sitting still. "My name is Harold Thompson," he began, his voice clear and strong. I served with the 37th Infantry Division in the Pacific during World War II. Some of you have been having fun saluting me lately." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Today, I'd like to tell you what a real salute means." He pulled out one of his old photographs, holding it up. "This was my unit in 1944. 23 men in this picture. Only 11 came home." His voice remained steady, but everyone could hear the weight of memory in his words. Each morning, when we saluted our flag, we weren't just following protocol. We were honoring those who didn't make it to see another sunrise. The room remained silent as Harold shared more photographs, each one telling a story of sacrifice and brotherhood. He told them about the young medic who saved his life when he was hit by shrapnel, about the nights when the only thing keeping them going was the thought of home, about the friends he had lost and the memories he carried. "Your leader, Mr. Davidson, understands what I'm talking about," Harold continued, nodding toward Steele. "He'd earned his Silver Star in Vietnam doing what any of us would have done, protecting his brothers. That's what a real soldier does." Some of the younger members looked at Steele in surprise. Many hadn't known about his medal. Steele stood a little straighter, his expression a mix of pride and respect for the older veteran before them. "Now, about my garden," Harold said, his voice taking on a gentler tone. "Those roses aren't just flowers. Each one represents a memory, a prayer, a moment of peace in a world that hasn't always been peaceful. When you destroyed them, you weren't just vandalizing an old man's garden. You were disrespecting every veteran who ever found healing in creating something beautiful after seeing so much ugliness in war." He looked around the room, making eye contact with each person. The younger members who had mocked him now couldn't meet his gaze, shame evident on their faces. Even the toughest-looking bikers seemed moved by his words. "I didn't come here to scold you or to ask for pity," Harold concluded. "I came because I see potential in this club. You have the power to be more than just a group that scares the neighborhood. You can be brothers who support each other and your community, just like we supported each other in combat." The silence that followed Harold's speech was broken by Steele's heavy boots walking across the wooden floor. He stopped in front of Harold and, in a move that surprised everyone, snapped to attention and gave him a perfect military salute. The gesture was genuine, filled with the kind of respect that can only come from one soldier to another. "Mr. Thompson," Steele said, lowering his hand, "would you mind sharing more about your experiences? Some of our younger members could learn a lot from you." His voice carried a subtle command that his club members instantly recognized. Harold pulled up a chair, his body tired from standing but his spirit energized by the attention he now had. The bikers gathered closer, forming a circle around him. Even the ones who had previously mocked him looked interested, their usual tough expressions softened by curiosity. "In the Pacific," Harold began, "we learned quickly that survival depended on brotherhood. It didn't matter where you came from or what you did before the war. What mattered was having each other's backs." He looked around the circle, seeing how his words resonated with both the older and younger members. One of the younger bikers, the one who had often led the harassment, raised his hand hesitantly. "Sir," he said, his voice unusually quiet, "my grandfather fought in Vietnam, but he never talked about it. He had a garden too, spent all his time there before he passed." Harold nodded understanding. "Many of us find peace in growing things," he explained. "After seeing so much destruction, creating life becomes a kind of therapy." Several veteran members of the club nodded in agreement, some sharing knowing looks. Steele pulled up his own chair. "Tell them about your Purple Heart, sir," he encouraged. "They need to understand what that medal really means." As Harold shared the story of how he earned his Purple Heart, saving 2 fellow soldiers while being hit by shrapnel himself, he noticed several bikers wiping their eyes discreetly. The tough exterior they usually showed the world had cracked, revealing the humanity beneath. "The hardest part wasn't getting hit," Harold continued, his voice soft but clear. "It was the nightmares afterward. That's when I learned about gardening. In the military hospital, there was a nurse who showed me how to plant seeds. She said, 'Every flower you grow is a victory over the darkness.'" One by one, the bikers began sharing their own stories. An older member talked about his struggles with PTSD after serving in Desert Storm. A younger one spoke about his brother who had returned from Afghanistan a changed man. Steele shared more about his experiences in Vietnam, things he had never told the younger club members before. The warehouse, which had so often echoed with loud music and aggressive behavior, now hummed with the quiet energy of genuine connection. Harold's garden had become more than just a topic. It was a symbol of healing that many of them understood on a deep level. You know, Steele said thoughtfully, we've been looking for a community project. Something to show people we're more than just noise and leather. He looked at Harold. Would you be willing to teach some of us about gardening? Maybe we could help rebuild your garden, make it even better than before. The younger biker who had mentioned his grandfather stood up. I'd like to help, he said, looking Harold in the eye for the first time without any trace of mockery. Maybe learn what my grandfather never got to teach me. Others quickly joined in, offering their help and resources. One member was a landscaper by trade, another worked at a garden center. What had started as a confrontation was transforming into something none of them had expected, a chance for healing and understanding across generations. Harold looked around at these men, seeing them not as the troublemakers who had destroyed his garden, but as brothers in a long line of veterans seeking peace after war. He saw in their eyes the same thing he had seen in his mirror many years ago, the need to create something beautiful after experiencing the ugliness of war. We can start tomorrow, Harold said, smiling warmly. There's a lot of work to be done, but together, we can make something special. The next morning, Harold woke up to an unusual sight. Instead of the regular rumble of motorcycles, he heard the sound of trucks pulling up outside his house. Looking through his window, he saw members of the Thunder Raiders unloading gardening supplies, tools, and dozens of rose bushes from various vehicles. Steele was directing operations like a military campaign. He had divided the club members into teams, each with specific tasks. The landscaper member, Tom, was marking areas for new flower beds with spray paint, while others were carefully removing the damaged plants and preparing the soil. Good morning, Mr. Thompson, called out the young biker who had mentioned his grandfather. His name was Jason, Harold had learned. He was wearing work clothes instead of his usual leather jacket and carrying a box of gardening tools. We brought breakfast too. Mrs. Chen helped us pick up some pastries from the bakery. Indeed, Mrs. Chen was there, looking both surprised and pleased as she arranged breakfast on Harold's porch table. Other neighbors, seeing the unexpected activity, began to emerge from their houses. Mr. Rodriguez, who had avoided eye contact for weeks, walked over with his son, both carrying their own gardening tools. We'd like to help too, if that's okay, Mr. Rodriguez said, smiling at Harold. My boy here could learn a thing or two about gardening. Harold found himself surrounded by a mix of bikers, neighbors, and curious onlookers, all waiting for his guidance. He cleared his throat, emotion making it difficult to speak for a moment. Well, he said finally, let's start by planning the layout. Each section should tell a story. Under Harold's direction, the garden began to take shape. The bikers worked tirelessly, their strong hands now carefully planting roses instead of revving engines. Steele had brought special roses, yellow ones to replace Martha's favorites, and new varieties that Harold had never seen before. These are called peace roses, Steele explained, showing Harold a beautiful cream-colored bloom with pink edges. They were first named in 1945, right after the war. Thought they'd be perfect for this garden. As the day progressed, something remarkable happened. The bikers began sharing stories as they worked. Jason learned that Harold had served in the same region as his grandfather. Tom, the landscaper, discovered that his father had been in the same Marine Corps division as Steele, just a few years apart. The neighborhood kids, who had once been scared of the bikers, were now fascinated by them. The club members showed them how to plant roses, explaining the importance of proper soil depth and watering. Some of the toughest-looking bikers turned out to be the most patient teachers. By late afternoon, the transformation was stunning. The garden had been expanded, with new paths winding between carefully arranged flower beds. The spray-painted wall had been cleaned and was now covered with a beautiful trellis, ready for climbing roses. But the most significant change wasn't in the garden itself. The Thunder Raiders had set up a small seating area in one corner, with benches arranged in a circle. For our new veteran support group, Steele explained to Harold, if you're willing to lead it, sir. Sometimes it's easier to talk about difficult things when your hands are busy with something beautiful. The other bikers had noticed how working in the garden brought a sense of peace. Even the youngest members, who had once mocked Harold's hobby, found themselves feeling calmer and more centered after hours of working with the soil. Mrs. Chen brought out cold lemonade for everyone, and Mr. Rodriguez's wife arrived with homemade tacos. The street, which had become silent and fearful in recent months, was now filled with conversation and laughter. "You've done more than rebuild a garden," Harold told Steele as they sat on the porch, watching the activity. "You've rebuilt a community." Steele nodded, looking at his club members interacting with the neighbors. Some were planning future projects, a community vegetable garden, flower beds around the warehouse, teaching programs for local kids. The Thunder Raiders were transforming from a source of neighborhood fear into a force for positive change. "Sometimes," Steele replied, "all it takes is someone brave enough to remind us of who we really are." 1 year later, Harold's garden had become the heart of the neighborhood. The roses bloomed more beautifully than ever, their colors painting the corner of Maple Street with vibrant shades of red, yellow, pink, and white. But the garden was no longer just Harold's. It had become a sanctuary for many. Every Wednesday evening, the Thunder Raiders parked their motorcycles quietly along the street for their veterans support group. They would gather in the garden's seating area, where Harold and Steele led discussions about their experiences. Some nights were filled with tears, others with laughter, but always with understanding. "My grandfather would have loved this place," Jason said one evening, tending to a rose bush he had planted himself. The young biker who had once mocked Harold's garden now spent hours there, learning everything he could about growing roses. He had even started a small garden of his own at home. The transformation of the Thunder Raiders had become a local legend. News stations had come to do stories about the unlikely friendship between the 93-year-old veteran and the motorcycle club. The reporters were always surprised to find the once intimidating bikers carefully pruning roses and teaching gardening classes to neighborhood children. The warehouse across the street had changed too. The walls, once covered in graffiti, now displayed beautiful murals of roses and military emblems, painted by local artists. The Thunder Raiders had turned part of their space into a community center where they offered free motorcycle repair classes and hosted events for veterans' families. Mrs. Chen no longer took the long way around with Pepper. Instead, she'd often stop to chat with the bikers, bringing them homemade dumplings and getting gardening advice in return. Mr. Rodriguez's son had become a regular at the garden, learning about both plants and military history from Harold's stories. One sunny morning, as Harold sat on his porch watching Steele teach a group of veterans about rose grafting, Emily arrived for her weekly visit. She looked around in amazement, still not quite used to the incredible change in the neighborhood. "Grandpa," she said, sitting beside him, "do you remember when I wanted you to move to that retirement home? I was so worried about you, but look at all this now." Harold smiled, watching as a group of bikers helped an elderly veteran plant a memorial rose for his fallen comrades. The man's hands shook as he patted the soil, but the Thunder Raiders stood by him patiently, offering quiet support and understanding. "Sometimes," Harold replied, "the best things in life come from our hardest moments. These boys needed a purpose, just like I did after the war. They just needed someone to remind them of who they could be." The garden had become more than just a beautiful space. It was a living symbol of healing and transformation. Veterans from all over the city would visit, finding peace among the roses and friendship with the Thunder Raiders. Some would arrive broken and distant, but the combination of gardening therapy and brotherhood slowly helped them find their way back. Steele had started keeping a journal of all the lives touched by the garden. "It's important to remember," he told Harold. "Every rose we plant, every veteran we help, every kid we teach, it's all part of your legacy, sir." The neighborhood children had created a special sign for the garden entrance. It read "Thompson Raiders Memorial Garden, where warriors find peace." Below it, they had painted small roses in different colors, each one representing a different branch of military service. As the sun set that evening, Harold watched the usual gathering in his garden. Young and old veterans worked side by side, their hands in the soil, their hearts healing together. The Thunder Raiders, once feared by the neighborhood, were now its guardians, ensuring that this space of healing would continue for generations to come. "Martha would have loved this," Harold whispered to himself, touching the yellow roses that still bloomed by the mailbox. He could almost hear her saying, "See, Harold? Sometimes the most beautiful gardens grow from unexpected seeds." The story of the 93-year-old veteran who transformed a biker club through compassion had become more than just a local legend. It was a testament to the power of understanding, the strength of brotherhood, and the healing magic of a garden tended with love.